All right, let's talk steering. So stock steering shaft on an HHR basically is not going to work for any kind of front mounted rack, but certain components will. And this is something that will probably help you guys. Your shaft to be different. The front one here is my shaft. The ends of the stock HHR, so this component that's splined goes onto the steering column. Okay, what happened for me to use it, because I'm using all aftermarket, I got a collapsible steering section in here, but the aftermarket U-joints, these little caps, are 15 millimeter. GM uses 16 millimeter caps, but when you take it all apart, the cross shafts are identical. So very easy to adapt an aftermarket steering joint to HHR ends. You basically just use the two caps, 16 millimeter, reassemble the U-joint, you're done. As I said, the cross shaft, they're 10 millimeter in each direction. The only difference is literally the cap size. So that will help you guys no matter what you build. Coming in here, kind of hard to see the whole shaft here, but I had to actually run a secondary U-joint because where the steering column wants to enter the engine bay was just right on the crease of where I set back my firewall. So I literally needed to kick it about like that. So that required a third U-joint, and consequence of that coming down was 1, 2, 3, and then I ended up with a double cardan here, and I'll talk about that right now. This again is the stock HHR end. The shaft and input on the rack is a 3/4 inch double D, so very easy to just order double D 3/4 inch shaft, universals, anything you want to do. The input shaft on the rack, on the HHR rack, when it was mounted below the firewall, literally stood straight up. Okay, so your steering shaft would be more like this. The way I have it mounted in my Corvette cross member, I'm literally horizontal as you see it now. Obviously there's going to be an angle, but I didn't have the room to use the stock HHR end, so it just created way too much angle in this U-joint. So by using the double cardan, they both mount onto the double D. The HHR rack has the 3/4 inch double D input. Thank you, GM. That made my life really easy. And by using the double here, it basically divides that angle between two U-joints. And obviously, if you look end for end, it shortened it up quite a bit. Consequence of using the double cardan with 3 U-joints is this shaft will want to flex everywhere. So in my last video, I showed you a little triangular plate that was welded to the frame. This is what bolts to it. So I made up this bracket, two 3/4 inch heims, because by using 2, that's actually installed in this section of the shaft here. It just locks that shaft. There's nowhere for it to flex. So we're tied into the frame. The U-joints are forced to do what U-joints do. And that's about it. Your steering will be different. But by using the aftermarket universal joints, reuse the aftermarket universal joint, or you can use the stock HHR. They're identical. Like I said, 10 millimeter cross shafts, both will work. But knowing that little trick might take a little bit of the scare in how am I going to steer this thing. So hopefully this works out well. I've had it all fitted to the car, so I already know it steers. All right, I installed the cross member mostly because I wanted to put the leaf spring in, so it's just much easier bolted in the car to wrestle with the monoleaf spring from the Corvette. You can see it sticking out here. So one advantage with the Corvette suspension is, if you don't want to use a monoleaf, you don't have to. Coilover kits readily available, readily bolt in. There is ways to lower a Corvette suspension. Looking in here, how all the clamps are and spacers, and by reducing the rubber and removing spacers and things like that, you can probably get 1 to 2 inches easily if need be. I'm going to go for it the way it is, see what we end up with ride height first once we're fully weighted. And cross member itself, probably talked a little bit about it, but it's been pretty much heavily modified for the steering for the HHR rack right here. The top of the A-arm here used to have a hump to it, so for me to lower that rack as much as I could, I cut that out, put in a flat plate there. Doesn't interfere with the control arm at all, but the control arm itself is a limiting factor, so anything I can do to lower it, I run into the control arm real quick. And then provisions to hard to see, I don't think you'll see in there, but you can see the rack is not only threaded through the cross member, but there's a 12mm bolt on the other end of it. The way I mounted the rack, because essentially it's single shear, means the top of the bolts aren't captured. If you have a look here, it's just the bolt. That's how it was in the HHR, although it was vertical. But the way I've done my cross member, you can pretty much see that rack is captured. If anything came loose, that rack can't really shift side by side, so that was a bonus. Got the motor mounts put in, both sides. All this has to come out to put the engine in. The steering, we can have a look here. There's a double cardan. Comes up into my double Heim, into the stock HHR boot. Bracket for the Heims, just bolts in, 3 bolts there. Everything is out of the way, incredibly low. I'm running a low mount alternator, doesn't even come close to hitting any of that. Hooker manifolds don't come close to hitting any of that, so that's about the best I can do with a Corvette suspension. Cross member itself had to get modified in here, a little bit of a notch. There was a factory one right here, you can see a little bit of a bow. That's where the stock shaft would have been on a Corvette, so basically just pulled the bottom in to match that up. Like that. Motor mounts all bolted in. Those suckers are Loctited now because they'll never have to come out again. Everything's painted. Brake booster is installed. That's the SS brake booster. I may have to change the fitting on here. Haven't quite figured out how the boost reference of all that works just yet, but for now, we'll leave her that way. Windshield water. I trimmed the cowl panel a little bit, made it a little bit nicer. You can see that look up here. Still not centered, but better than it was. Coming inside the car, steering shaft coming out through the HHR boot. Master cylinder, splined to go right onto the HHR steering rack, or steering column. Once I get the dash in, you'll see all that. So essentially, guys, that's the steering. The only stock component from the HHR steering is this piece right here, but she's stout. Only other unknown is I think I'm leaning towards using an HHR LT body control module, wiring harness, everything, because this car is going to end up being a panel, so that's already set up for the remote fob, for the rear doors, blah, blah, blah. So that means I'll be using the LT steering column. I don't know if there's any difference between the power steering motor itself. Shouldn't be. The rack, I know there is. It's a different ratio for the SS, so this is an SS rack, but You know, these are all the things we have to figure out as we go. So everything, all of this had to get figured out, had to get modified, installed, bolts in, relocated, steering a little bit. So what I was saying about the steering is the shaft would come right out on this edge here on the stock. So it's been moved over about 2 inches with the use of that third joint. Trimmed up the boot a little bit. Could have done a better job. Other than that, cross members coming out, motors going on it. We're going to have the motor, trans, full suspension in the next video. Thanks for watching.